Good evening, or morning, or whatever it is. I guess Luther always says, he always says good morning, though, isn't it? Good morning. It's great to see everyone this morning. Very cool morning today. Definitely fall is on its way in here, and so got to get ready for that. It's great to see everybody this morning, and hope you've had a good weekend. If you want to, you go ahead and be opening your Bibles to Judges chapter 9. That's where we'll be studying today in our class. We'll get into that here in just a moment. Joe, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer before we begin our class?
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we're so thankful that you allowed us another day to live, to enjoy this beautiful land in which we live, to come to this quiet place and to worship you. We're so grateful for the health that we enjoy, and we realize there are many who are not as fortunate as we. Pray that you'll be with them. Pray that you'll be with Brent as he begins this study. Pray that you'll be with us as we try to glean from the pages of your word things that will help us in our everyday lives and lead us to heaven. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you so much. All right, as we continue in our study of the book of Judges, we've just finished up studying about Gideon over the last few weeks, and Gideon wasn't seeking to become a leader. In fact, it was seemingly the last thing in the world he wanted was to be a leader of God's people, but God chose him, and then God did extraordinary things through this ordinary man. And all of the excitement of everything that we talked about in talking about Gideon is going to make this chapter a little bit even more depressing, probably. Because as we move from one generation to the next, and we talk about Gideon's son, Abimelech, things start to take a nosedive for God's people in this particular period of their history. And we see Abimelech as somebody who craves power, and he craves to be that leader, but he craves it for all the wrong reasons, and he has all of the worst intentions about what to do with it. And as he does take over leadership of God's people, he takes them in the wrong direction as well. And under Gideon, we saw the people united to go do what God had called them to do, and they achieved great success. But during the time of Abimelech, we see them turn on each other. And it's very sad. And unfortunately, this is the way it's going to go for quite some time as we study through this book, and as we talk about Samson and some of the other judges that we have to come. So we're talking about Abimelech this morning. Gideon has 70 sons. Abimelech was Gideon's son by his concubine, and that made him an outsider. He wasn't looked at the same as the other 70 sons of Gideon, and probably grew up with this sort of mindset of someone who is an outsider, that whatever he was going to have to get in life, he was going to have to do it on his own. And that kind of becomes his mantra. He pursues success, he pursues his ambition, and he will do whatever it takes to achieve what he wants to achieve. He'll step on and use anyone he has to get it, and that's the way he pursues his life. Now, what does this have to do with us? For me, where this story of Abimelech comes home to me is it emphasizes the importance of being very careful to choose who you're going to follow in your life. We're all following someone, something. We're being influenced by various people, various things that are at work in our lives. And the more of that we take in, the more it affects the way we think. As it affects the way we think, it affects what we feel. What we feel has a huge impact on what we choose to do and our actions. To be very careful about about the influence that we take into our way of thinking, to be very careful about who we choose to follow. That'll be a reoccurring theme as we study through the life of Abimelech. Now, another thing that kind of makes this a little bit of a dark scene is where it all takes place. All of the events of today's chapter that we're going to study center around a place called Shechem. And Shechem has an important role in the history of God's people, particularly in the Old Testament. Because when you look back to like Genesis 12, for example, Shechem was the place where God had appeared to Abram to tell him the great things that He had stored for him in his life, that He was going to give this land to Abraham and his descendants. And it was at Shechem where Abram first built an altar to worship God. Now, trust me, he built plenty more before his life was over. In fact, everywhere Abraham went, one of the first things he did was to build him a place to worship and adore God. But Shechem was where it all started. That's the first one that's recorded of Abraham building this altar to worship God. So the history of this people really started right there in that place. And it's why years later, after the people came out of Egypt and Joshua led them into the Promised Land, and they achieved their first victories at Jericho and then eventually at Ai, Joshua brought the people to Shechem, and there he built an altar and they worshiped God. And you can read about that in Joshua chapter 8 in the latter part of that chapter. So, this was where it all started, both for Abraham and then later for Joshua and the people. It was a place of great significance in the history of these people. And it's very sad in Judges 9 to see it all start to fall apart there. What's the point? It's in the minds of people that lived back then, Shechem would be the last place that you would expect people to start turning away from God. The life to start to go away from the life that God would want His people to live. That would be the last place that you would ever expect those kinds of things to happen, and yet it did. It goes to show, folks, you can never take anything for granted. You can never take anything for granted. God's people have to continue to believe. They have to continue to invest themselves in living the life that God has called them to live. And the way I look at it is, I feel so blessed to be a part of a congregation that has such a long and rich history of being a light shining in this community. But you can't take anything for granted. The only way that this place will continue to be what it's always been is for each generation to take that torch and run with it faithfully. Be people that God would have us to be. Don't want this story of Shechem and the way that it departed from what it once was. You don't want that story to ever repeat itself. So we're looking to prevent that as we work our way through this chapter. And as I said, it's to me that the main emphasis of this chapter is to be careful who you follow. You know, as you think about influences, you know, when I was thinking about this and preparing for this sermon, I was thinking about how this day and time, you always hear people say, "Follow us." We have a Facebook page. Follow us on Facebook. We have Instagram. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter. We're putting out information. We're putting out various things that we want you to see. We want you to hear it. We want you to take it in. That kind of pursuit is out there everywhere. And it influences us, I believe, much more than we realize. It's always important for us to be on guard about those things, to be careful about the influences that we are allowing to lead us. All right, so let's see how that plays out in Judges chapter 9 with Abimelech. All right, let's start out in verse 1. Then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, that's another name for Gideon, he went to Shechem to his mother's brothers and spoke with them and with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, Please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. Which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you? Remember that I am your flesh and bone. And his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, and their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, He is our brother. Now, let's stop there for a second. Evidently, Abimelech was one of those guys that just has that it factor. He must have been a very dynamic personality. He just exuded this confidence. And sometimes people will get behind a guy like that, and it is sort of just totally drown out what he's doing and what he's saying. No one seems to ask many questions about exactly what it is that Abimelech wants to do. He just comes to essentially his uncles, his mother's brothers, and he says, Gideon's gone. He's got these 70 men, these 70 sons, but we don't need to be led by 70 men. We need one man who will be our leader, who will take the reins and lead us forward. And wouldn't it be better for us to just have one man leading the charge than going in 70 different directions? And there's just something about that confidence that really took them in. And no one seems to ask Abimelech, well, what is it that you have in mind? What is it that you want to do? I think you see that play out in politics a lot. Lots of times it has as much to do with the celebrity of the person as it does the actual policies that they intend to put into place. And certainly a lot of times, and I'm just being bluntly honest, has very little to do with the character of the person. I don't know about you, but I am tired of going into elections and having to make a choice between the lesser of two evils. I want somebody I believe in. I want somebody who has the character that men in this country and women ought to follow. I'm ready for someone to be that person that we can believe in. It's been a long time, I think, since we've had it. That's just me. But when you have that kind of vacuum created where you don't have people of character who step forward to be the leaders that they really need to be, this is what happens when you have fellows like Abimelech. They rise in situations like that. And it can happen in the church, it can happen in politics, it can happen in every facet of life. So evidently they get behind how dynamic this man's personality is and don't bother to ask him what it is he really wants to do. Well, verse 4. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal Berith. There's your first indication of things going bad. Look where the funds for this is coming from. From these idol gods of the Canaanites. With which, so they give all of this silver to Abimelech. They say, we're behind you. We're investing. We're giving you the funds that you need to get this going. Notice what he does with it. With which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, because he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. This is not Midianites doing this. It's not Ammonites. It's not Philistines. These are God's own people who have now conspired with Abimelech to assassinate the 70 sons of Gideon, who just led them with God's help to relief from the Midianites. You think, God's people are not capable of things like that. I wish that were true. When they get behind the wrong person, evidently they're capable of almost anything. And so Shechem, which was a place that was once celebrated, is now a place that has a definite stain on its reputation that it will never get rid of. Abimelech is that kind of leader who is motivated only by his selfish ambitions. He has no principles of right or wrong. The only thing that motivates him is succeeding in what it is he means to do. He cares not who he hurts to get it. He cares not who he uses to get it. He cares not about what's right or what's wrong. All that matters is for him to succeed in what it is that he seeks to do. And unfortunately, there's a significant portion of God's people that get behind him in that and go along with it. It's a reminder of the danger that can be done when people who are lacking character are put in a position to influence and lead people. A truly humble man is hard to find. That's why I celebrate stories like one I recently came across about Booker T. Washington, one of my favorite persons of history to read about and study. As you know, Booker T. Washington was an African-American educator and an outstanding example of the right kind of leadership. Shortly after he took over the presidency of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, as the story goes, he was walking along a very exclusive section of town one day when he was stopped by a wealthy white woman. And she didn't recognize him, didn't know who he was. And so she stopped him on the street and offered him a few dollars to chop some wood for her that day. Because he had no pressing business at the moment, Professor Washington smiled, rolled up his sleeves, and proceeded to do the humble chore that she requested. When he had finished, carried the logs into the house and stacked them by the fireplace. A little girl, as he was finishing up, recognized him and later revealed his identity to the lady. The next morning, the lady, of course, was embarrassed to see. She went to see Mr. Washington in his office at the Institute and apologized profusely. He said, "It's all perfectly all right, madam." He said, "Occasionally I enjoy a little manual labor, and besides, it's always a delight to do something for a friend." She shook his hand warmly and assured him that his meek and gracious attitude had endeared him and his work to her heart. Not long afterward, she showed her admiration by persuading some of her wealthiest acquaintances to join her in donating thousands of dollars to the Tuskegee Institute. That's leadership. That's leadership in its purest form. To just be the person that does the right thing. Even to the rudest, meanest, nastiest people, even in the most awkward and undesirable of circumstances, a person that's committed to doing the right thing in each situation. That's what real leadership is. That's why when God gives the stipulations for the men who are to be chosen as leaders in the church, to be elders or to be deacons, when you look at the list of those qualifications that are given, they have very little to do with his education. They have nothing to do with his education. They have very little to do with his business savvy or the kind of dynamic things that people typically look for in a leader. All of those qualifications revolve around one thing and one thing only: his character. What kind of man is he? Does he love God and respect God? Does he love his wife and treat her respectfully? Does he love his children, and has he done his best to lead them in the right way that they should go? Does he love the Word of God? Does he have the courage to take a stand for it? Those kinds of things. God's looking for character. You see this later when David was chosen to be king. Samuel goes to anoint him, and all of Jesse's sons are brought in before Samuel, and those first few boys that come through, they're the strong, strapping lads, and they're Jesse's best workers. Surely it's got to be one of them. Samuel keeps passing on all of those, till finally there's only one left. Samuel says, "Jesse, don't you have any other sons?" "Well, there's only one, but he's the runt of the litter. He's the puniest one." And they bring David in before, and Samuel anoints him, and he explains, God doesn't look on the outward appearance. He doesn't see as man sees. He looks on the heart. So, to me, that's what's at the heart of this story with Abimelech, is how drastically things can change when you get behind the wrong kind of leadership. Now, what you have next, oh, by the way, any questions or comments about what we're talking about at this point? All right, picking up at verse 7, there was one son of Gideon that escaped this assassination plot by Abimelech, and his name is Jotham. And what you have beginning in verse 7 is a fable or a parable that he gives to sort of highlight the situation as it is. I want to read through this because it really captures this point that I'm trying to make about leadership. All right, verse 7. Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them, "Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' But the olive tree said to them, 'Should I cease giving my oil?' With which they honor God and men, and go to sway over trees. Then they said to the fig tree, 'You come and reign over us.' But the fig tree said to them, 'Should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to sway over the trees?' Then the trees said to the vine, 'You come and reign over us.' But the vine said to them, 'Should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, and go to sway over trees?' Then all the trees said to the bramble, 'You come and reign over us.' And the bramble said to the trees, 'If in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon.'" So picture the scene. It's a parable. And the trees are seeking a leader, a king. And they go first to the olive tree. "Be our leader, reign over us." And as you know, especially in Palestine, the olive tree is one of the most prized and cherished of all trees. The olive was a crop of great income for the people back then, both the fruit and the oil that they would extract from it. But the olive tree in response says, "I'm too busy with my business. I don't have time to go and reign over you." So they move on to the fig tree. And after the olive tree, the fig tree. You know how many times the fig tree is mentioned in Scripture. It too was something that was prized and cherished by the people, something that would have been celebrated. But fig tree says, I'm too busy bearing my fruit. I've got other things to tend to. I can't reign over you. So then from there they go to the vine. And I mean, it doesn't, if you think about three staple crops in the area of Palestine, olives, figs, and grapes. These are their main staples of survival. And so they go to the vine. Please, reign over us. And the vine says basically the same thing. Should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and man? I've got other things. Other things that are more important. So then they go to the bramble. The bramble is like a thorn bush. It's weeds. There's not one productive thing you can do with bramble other than set a fire. Those thorns make it impossible to work with. It doesn't bear fruit. And even though they go to the bramble and they say to the bramble, lead us, reign over us, he says, oh yes, and you will find shelter under my shade. The bramble doesn't give shade. Number one, it's not tall enough. Number two, it doesn't have leaves. But that's what you get. Sometimes when a person has that kind of dynamic personality, they can make the emptiest of promises and people will buy them right and left. And that's exactly what happened here. And they took the bramble and the bramble reigned over them. Why? Because the point of it is the olive tree wouldn't step forward. The fig tree wouldn't step forward. The grapevine wouldn't step forward. And when these other people of character wouldn't step forward to do what God called them to do, it created a vacuum for this loser to come in and lead the people away from God. And that's exactly what happened here. Excuse me. Cannot afford for history to repeat itself. We cannot afford today to be like the olive tree. It says, well, I know they need me at church, but, I just got other things going on right now. Or like the fig tree. Well, I know they need me at church, but I'm just so busy raising my figs. Or the vine. Creating a vacuum for the next generation to go follow someone else who will lead them into destruction, just like Abimelech did. Verse 16. Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, if you have dealt well with Jerubbabel and his house, and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house this day, and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. It's not a good reason to make someone king if he's not a man of character. Yeah, let's stop there. If then you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbabel and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Millo, and let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled. He went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother. Basically, what his speech says is, he says to the people, you take an honest look at yourself and ask yourself, have you done what you should have done? Were you fair to Gideon, who did so much for you? Were you fair to him by allowing his 70 sons to be assassinated? Were you fair to him by getting behind this man who wants to lead you astray? Have you done what God wanted you to do? He asked them those honest questions, and then he sort of fades away from the story. So what you have in the remaining part of this chapter are the battles that Abimelech goes into. Starting in verse 22, Abimelech begins to reign over Israel, and there is this. And even though Shechem is sort of where he exalted himself, it doesn't take very long, about 3 years, before the men of Shechem began to turn against him. And he begins to make war with them. Later on, verse 26, this man named Gael takes the people of Shechem and he begins to assemble them to fight against Abimelech. And this battle goes back and forth. Eventually, if I may summarize, Abimelech chases them until it's just a few of them left, and they flee to this tower, and they've all kind of assembled in there. And Abimelech tells his soldiers, You watch me and do what I do. And Abimelech goes into the forest and he cuts down this tree and he drags it over to this tower where all of these people are hiding, and he places it there at the foot of it. All of the other people come and do the same thing. And once they have this pile of wood there at the foot of the tower, Abimelech sets fire to it. Kills all of the men of Shechem trapped inside of it. And then later on, let's see. Let's pick it up at verse 50. Later on, as he goes against the men of Thebez, this scene starts to kind of play itself out in a familiar way. Let's start reading in verse 50. Then Abimelech went to Thebez, and he encamped against Thebez and took it. But there was a strong tower in the city, and all the men and women, all the people of the city fled there and shut themselves in. Then they went up to the top of the tower. So Abimelech came as far as the tower and fought against it, and he drew near the door of the tower to burn it with fire. Done this before, right? Worked last time, it'll work this time. And it seems as if his victory is inevitable. Just like before. He's put them on the run. He's chased them to their last stand. Now they have nowhere else to run. They are defenseless against him. It appears as if there's no way he can fail. No way he could not succeed to gain even more power with this. It would appear that way. But notice what happens next, verse 52. Verse 53. But a certain woman dropped an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Lane Kiffin is lucky they were just throwing golf balls at him last night. This lady had much larger intentions for Abimelech. She dropped a millstone. You know how massive these millstones are, right? They would have to have animals to pull them so that they could crush the corn or the wheat or whatever it was to grind it into meal. Huge, massive thing. Somehow or another she got that thing up to that window and then just sort of let gravity do the rest. Fell on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, Draw your sword and kill me, lest men say of me, a woman killed me. So his young man thrust him through, and he died. And the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead. They departed, every man to his place. Thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father by killing his 70 brothers. And all the evil of the men of Shechem God returned on their own heads, and on them the curse of Jotham, the son of Jeroboam. You see, when a person goes the way that Abimelech goes, his judgment is going to come. It's just a matter of time. If he doesn't repent, if he doesn't turn away, his judgment will come. And sometimes God brings it in the most humbling of fashion, as he did here with Abimelech. But not only did judgment come to Abimelech, but it came to those who followed him too. And that brings us full circle to where we started when we started this lesson. It's imperative for God's people to be careful about who they follow, who they get behind, who they allow to influence their thinking, who they allow to become a role model and pattern for how they're going to live their lives. It's imperative that we be extremely careful in that regard. So as you come down to chapter 10, we're going to have the next two judges are much like Shamgar in that very little is told about them, but nonetheless they are named and given as a part of this story. But verse 1 says, "After Abimelech there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he dwelt in Shamir in the mountains of Ephraim. He judged Israel 23 years, and he died and was buried in Shamir." Notice something about that. With all of the other judges, there's like some enemy that the judge comes to deliver them from. What enemy is mentioned here? Who did Tola come to rescue God's people from? Themselves. After the leadership of Abimelech, they've fallen so far from where God would have them to be. They needed somebody to rescue them from themselves. And evidently, that's what Tola came to do. All right, that's all of my time for this morning. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, so next week we'll pick up in chapter 10, and we'll talk about Jephthah.